Right, so the candidates have concluded, and we have a new challenger, and that would be Sergei Karyakin. He won today over Caruana, securing first place in the candidates tournament and securing the right to play a world championship match with Magnus Carlsen later this year in New York City. So we are going to focus on that game. We're not going to do the usual highlight recap all of the games quickly. We're going to have a look at the Karyakin Caruana game in full, in some depth. We're going to more or less ignore the other games. Anand was the only one who had any chance of catching the two leaders going into this round. He drew his game, so he did not manage to catch them. Also of note, Geary with the 14th straight draw, as predicted. That's pretty good. So, anyways, without further ado, let's have a look at the game. So e4, c5. So this is where the tiebreak situation is already sort of starting to show. I kind of doubt that under any other circumstances besides needing a win with black in the last round of the candidates tournament would Caruana be playing a Sicilian in an event like this. But I mean, you've got to stir up some winning chances, and he decided that playing e5 wasn't going to cut it in this case. So we went with the Sicilian. I remember a few years ago he was experimenting with the French a little bit, so I was half expecting him to try that. But no, we have a Sicilian. Knight f3, knight c6, and now d4. Now, Karyakin needs only a draw to clinch victory in the tournament, so it might seem like a strange decision to go for the sort of sharp lines of the open Sicilian when you've got other options at your disposal, like the sort of quieter Rossolimo variation with bishop b5. But the thing about d4, first of all, is it's what Karyakin plays, so it's what he knows the best. So it makes sense to play what you know the best in such an important game. Second of all, while the lines of the open Sicilian are sharp, at its high level, they're so well worked out that a position where there's a lot of piece contact that's still known to theory is sort of more likely to fizzle out into a simplified equalish position. Because if you play bishop b5, then it's probably going to be a long positional struggle, and there's not going to be so many forcing lines, so pieces are going to stay on the board longer, and that maybe means that black's got more chances to maneuver his way to a victory. But with d4, um, the theory is worked out to a point where you see Caruana has to be very careful what line he chooses from this point, because there are a lot of variations that are considered to be fine by theory, but they'll lead to positions where white's got a slight edge or the game is equal, but black has no realistic winning chances because of the forcing lines that have occurred earlier have kind of simplified the position. Okay, for example, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6. Um, Okay, so for example, you can't really choose the accelerated dragon, and earlier you couldn't really choose the dragon proper. The dragon proper is worked out to a draw in so many different variations. You can't really go with that. And after g6, white can play either knight c3, or he can play c4. And it's sort of well known that uh, black at a high level doesn't really have realistic winning chances in this variation. And he's more or less trying to get a draw, and if white overpresses, he might win. But yeah, that's not going to be a particularly good choice in a must-win game. And furthermore, playing, say, the Sveshnikov, which I think has a pretty good reputation at the moment, the lines are worked out to such a degree that it's very difficult to play for a win in them. So, I mean, one of the main lines like knight b5, d6, bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5. So basically, the point of this variation is that white has moved his knight a bunch of times, and it's now on the weird a3 square. On the other hand, black has given up the d5 square, and white's going to stick a piece there. So the two main lines are knight d5 and bishop takes f6, with the idea of putting knight on d5, then playing either c3 or c4, bringing this knight back to c2 and trying to reroute it back into play. Meanwhile, black is trying to get counterplay with f5, while white's busy moving his knights around in a circle. But yeah, those lines generally are very, very well worked out because it's been considered for a while to be a very good system. It's had a lot of testing at high level, which means that, again, the theory has been worked out to an excruciating degree which makes it very difficult to play for the win as black. So Caruana went for d6, and this is the classical Sicilian, which according to, I was watching the Chess24 coverage, according to Robin van Kampen, who apparently used to be a big specialist in this line. This line isn't supposed to be very good anymore, but it's a good way to play for the win as black, because black will likely end up in a slightly worse position, but they say it's easier to play for a win in a slightly worse position than in a dead equal position, as well. So he's definitely imbalancing the position. He's trying to get away from what's been really topical recently, and it's probably a decent choice. So Karyakin goes for the absolute main line with bishop g5. This is the Rouser system. So basically what white's wanting to do is he's going to go queen d2 and castle. And again, it looks strange to go for the sort of sharp opposite side castling. Well, actually not opposite side castling in this case, because black's not intending on castling. But it seems weird to go for such a sharp line. But as we've mentioned earlier, it's what's considered best. It's what Karyakin knows best. And yeah, it's not necessarily going to put him in that much risk of losing the game. e6, queen d2. Notice that sometimes in these lines, black wants to go e5, like if white plays, let's say, bishop e2, e5, but that's not very good with the bishop on g5, because after e5, this bishop on g5 means that he's always in a position to be able to take and go knight d5, which is not pleasant for black. So e6 instead is the best move. Queen d2, and now there are a few options. Black can sort of play this quieter system with bishop e7 and castle, but Caruana elected to play, I guess, more of a sharp line, where he's going to delay castling in the hopes of imbalancing the position, as well as he's trying to not walk into these sort of automatic kingside attacks. And he's also getting some other options by leaving his king in the center. So, I mean, after bishop e7, one way the game could continue would be, let's say, castles, f4. And now they'd usually take on d4, take queen a5, and then bishop c4, bishop b7, e5, d takes e5, f takes e5, bishop c6. So the point is that e takes f6 can be met by queen takes g5 check. That's important. And then let's say bishop d2, knight d7. And yeah, white now can play knight d5, queen d8, and take on e7 and get the bishop pair. And yeah, this is, I looked this up in ChessBase. This is the main line of the variation starting with bishop e7 and castles, more or less. And this is sort of a typical position where white's got the bishop pair. He's not necessarily too much better, but I can't see black winning this. Right, let's go back. So he went a6 instead. So he's preparing b5 at some future moment, whilst not committing his pieces to any squares yet. And to the point of leaving this bishop on f8 is actually it's going to come to h6 later, but we'll see that later. Castle, bishop d7, and now there's two choices here. White can go either f4 or f3. With f3, he's intending to play sort of an English attack style, g4, put the bishop back on e3, h4, and so on. Karyakin elected for f4 instead, and h6 was played, bishop h4. Now, here's where you can see sort of kind of the limitations put on Fabiano playing in a situation where he has to win. One way to play here that's considered to be sort of okay is knight takes e4. With the point that, okay, knight takes e4 can be met by queen takes h4. And bishop takes d8 can be met by knight takes d2. And black's more or less won a pawn here. Instead, queen e1 is supposed to be the best move. So anyways, knight takes e4 is sort of decent, but basically it simplifies the position a bit. White's going to go knight f5, and at some stage he's probably going to win his pawn back on d6. And the position, again, is becoming a bit more simplified. And this isn't something that Karo wants to have happen. So he goes b5, which is a bit of a sideline. Another line is g5, but again, this is very well known. It's a very sharp line, and the theory is again, fairly well worked out. So, okay, b5 instead. Bishop takes f6, and now, after g takes f6, we reach this sort of typical structure for the rouser. Black doesn't really want to take with the queen, because then e5 stuff is likely to be awkward at some point. So, like, queen takes f6, e5, d takes e5, and then knight d takes b5, for instance, and this bishop on d7 is undefended, is going to likely cause problems for black. So they usually play g takes f6 anyways. And here we see the point of black not going bishop e7 so many moves ago, is that he's now intending on playing h5 and bishop h6. And yeah, in blitz games, a lot of times white blunders his queen along here, but in any event, the bishop's quite active, and white's probably at some point going to have to take out a couple turns to get his pieces off of the c1 h6 line. So he's going to have to take a timeout to go king b1, take a timeout to go queen e1. Both of those are useful moves in general, but the bishop is arguably more active on h6 than it would be on e7. So f5 is played, and yeah, he's just trying to disturb, because currently black got a very solid formation in the center. His king's fairly well defended at the moment, so Sergey's trying to break all that up by going f5. Now, it's important to note that you can't really push past this with e5, because then you give up the d5 square, and that's quite significant. So that wasn't played. Okay, so queen b6 was played. It's also very possible to go h5 right away, intending bishop h6, but he decided to go queen b6 first. And f takes e6, f takes e6, and Karyakin trades on c6. Perhaps if the situation were reversed and it were Karyakin who had to win, maybe he would try knight e2 to keep more pieces on the board, and maybe hint at coming to f4. But okay, he decided that an exchange of pieces doesn't hurt him, so he gets those guys off the board. It's also quite a decent move in general. Queen takes c6. Somehow queen takes c6 seems a bit unnatural. I'm sure it's fine. I'm looking at the computer right now. It wants black to play bishop takes c6. That's kind of the more natural way to treat the position. But okay, queen takes c6. Probably nothing wrong with. And white plays bishop d3. So, there's perhaps ideas of going e5 and bishop g6 check to try to attack. h5 was played again. Bishop h6 is now the threat, so you have to deal with that either by stepping your king off of the diagonal or stepping your queen off the diagonal. He chose to play king b1, which is, I guess, more useful in general than queen e1, although they're both playable here. King b1 and b4. So, yeah, b4 is quite an aggressive move. It's very ambitious. It's kicking the knight away from c3. Although you can make the argument that knight is now going to come to d4 or f4, and it's arguably improving its positioning. But okay, b4 also gains space on the queen side, so that can't be too bad. And queen c5. So here, this position was reached in one other game. It was in 1988, I think, between Prancetter and Kozul. And Kozul, who was playing black in that game, is a specialist in the classical Sicilian with black. And he faced a really strong attack following e5 with bishop g6 to come and his king in the center and not all of his pieces out. And that was really scary for black. Instead, Karyakin decided to play rook hf1, which is sort of a safer, not wanting to take a risk move, because if he plays e5, he gives up a pawn for a strong attack, and even if the attack is objectively stronger than the pawn, he's giving chances to Caruana to have something to play for. Like if he's got an extra pawn, then if he survives the attack, then he's got realistic winning chances. So he decided, I guess, that there wasn't any need to take that risk, and so he just simply improved his last piece and wanted to get on with the game. So bishop h6, queen e1, and now a5. Okay, so here white has uh, the opportunity to capture on f6, but even though this is probably okay, there's no real need to do this. Again, Karyakin doesn't want to be the one to take unnecessary risks. And the reason why black has fairly decent compensation here is he's now opened a diagonal for a bishop on g7, which previously would not have been opened. Like, okay, if black wanted to say, I'm going to put my bishop on g7, I'm going to play f5, and I'm going to open this towards your king. The problem with that is when you play f5, e takes f5, your own king is going to be significantly weakened. But if white plays rook takes f6, at the cost of a pawn, black has had his bishop's diagonal open. And combined with a queen coming to e5, there could be some pretty decent pressure on b2, which there's no reason for white really to allow. So instead, b3 was played. Which is reasonable. He is, among other things, securing the c4 square for the bishop, which is, if white is deciding he doesn't want to play e5, sacrifice a pawn, and go bishop g6 check, c4 is then the best square for your bishop, because you don't want to keep it on d3 blocked by your own pawn. So yeah, unless you're going to sacrifice this guy, c4 is the logical option for that bishop. So black activated his rook to g8, and white played g3. So it's again possible to sacrifice the pawn on g2, but Karyakin didn't feel any need to do that. So like you can play queen h4 or bishop c4. Let's say bishop c4. Rook takes g2. And let's go with knight d4. Then black can probably hold stuff together with queen e5. And, I mean, again, it's not really necessary to sacrifice a pawn for Karyakin here. So, like, unless it's clearly the best move, he doesn't want to either grab pawns unnecessarily or give away pawns unnecessarily, because it really does give his opponent something concrete to play for. So g3 makes a lot of sense. The rook's got an open file, but it's now kind of blunted along the open file by this pawn on g3. Which is nice for white. So Caruana has to decide what he's going to do with his king. He put it on e7. Okay, so it's obviously too late to castle kingside. He never was planning on doing that in the first place. Castling queenside is sometimes an option in the Sicilian, but I think in this case it's just too risky. Having already pushed all of your queenside pawns up the board, and stuff like c3 able to happen, that's not really a good idea. So he just put the king on e7, and he's connected the rooks. The king is relatively safe on e7. He's got a sort of a wall of pawns here. It's not especially easy to break through. There's not really any clear pawn breaks. He's already used up his f5 break, so that doesn't exist anymore. e5 doesn't really do much anymore. So despite the king being in the center and maybe looking a bit unsafe, there's not really any clear, concrete way to break through at it. But it does carry some risk, of course. Black is going to have to be very careful to ensure that a breakthrough never happens. Bishop c4 and bishop e3. So he's putting the bishop on a dark square in white's camp, and that's a little bit annoying. If this knight moves, there's the potential to transfer it to d4, and maybe, along with queen e5, somehow create some annoying threats on the dark squares. Rook f3 was played, intending to double on the f-file with the queen behind it. And, yeah, possibly hinting at an exchange sacrifice, although I kind of doubt that. So, rook g4 was played, activating another piece. It's also possible to just go ahead and play a4 and try to open the a-file. Maybe that's a bit more incisive. But rook g4 is okay too. He's threatening the e4 pawn. He's activating his rook. And And yeah, so here white could play knight f4. Knight f4 is reasonable. Then black would probably exchange off his bishop for the knight, because otherwise the bishop's maybe starting to get a bit awkward in here, maybe get trapped. And also the knight on f4 is quickly becoming a very good piece, so it makes sense to exchange it off. G takes f4, rook a g8, and yeah, I mean, black's now got the open g file to work with, potentially. White, now that his g pawn has become an f pawn, has potential to break with e5. So yeah, that's one way to proceed with white. Karyakin decided to ignore what black was doing and continue with his plan of playing queen f1. And he's creating a counter threat on f6. Now, if rook takes e4, rook takes f6 happens, that's a trade of pawns, but it's a really poor deal for black because white has managed to now break through, and he's got a place to attack black's king from. So that's a really poor deal for black. He shouldn't allow that. He should instead play rook f8, which he did, covering this pawn. The downside now is that there's no more a4, open the a file, and do that sort of thing. Which I guess is progress for white in terms of he's basically shut down black's attack, and now he can focus on his own attack. And now he decided to go knight f4, which makes a lot of sense. Bishop takes f4, and rather than g takes f4, he decided to play rook takes f4, which I guess makes sense because previously g takes f4 was being followed up by e5, which made a great deal of sense while white queen was backing it up on the e-file. But now that the queen has come to the f-file, he'd rather have the f-file stay open and not close it with g takes f4. So rook takes f4 is reasonable. Now if black takes this, then white can proceed with g takes f4 now and try to play f5 and weaken the light squares. I guess the reason why he didn't want to play g takes f4 here is, well, now he's got this kind of battery to nowhere. So now if he trades off this rook first, then he doesn't really have like a sort of redundant piece on f3, I guess. That's my best explanation for capturing with the rook first. Also, he's managed to simplify the position a bit. That could be the real reason. He's gotten a set of rooks off the board and one step closer to a simplified position and the draw which he needs. So anyways, a4 was played and b takes a4 was played. Notice that despite white's king now being a bit optically unsafe, this isn't really a problem because, first of all, the b file's not open. There's a pawn on b4, and the b3 break never really works because white's covering that so many times. And black's pieces, aside from maybe his queen, are really in no position at all to be attacking white's king. So bishop takes a4, but really, black needs more munition to be able to make this attack work. That being said, I don't think, objectively speaking, black's in any danger either. Yeah, it's still a game, obviously. So queen d3, trying to put pressure on d6, bishop c6, bishop b3, and rook g5. So he's trying to keep that set of rooks on the board. And Karyakin finally decided to try and strike. He sacrificed a pawn with e5. Now, whether that's objectively necessary, I'm not sure. But white does generate quite a bit of play by sacrificing this pawn. In all likelihood, black was going to play, I think, rook e5 at some point soon, more or less shutting down that idea. So he wanted to get it in before black had a chance to stop it. And white does, this queen now has access to h7, this rook now has lateral access to c4, and white does activate those two pieces quite a bit by giving this pawn. Although this does seem like a really strange decision considering the situation. Like, he could, alternatively to sacrificing a pawn, he could also not sacrifice a pawn, and probably just overall have less chances to lose the game. But okay, I mean, he, I guess, decided that he had enough compensation and decided to make a winning attempt, which in the end was fruitful, so you can't really fault him. So rook takes e5, he went rook c4, which leaves black actually with only one good move. Because the queen can't move to some random square because it's tied down to d6. And if he tries queen d5, that loses to the variation queen a7 check, rook f7, rook takes d5, rook takes h7, takes on e5, and then at the end of the line he picks up the bishop on c6. So rook d5 is actually the only move that saves, counterattacking white's queen. And rook takes c5, rook d3 doesn't do anything. So queen e2 instead. Now, yeah, it sort of looks like white doesn't get quite enough compensation for his pawn. It's still not easy to actually convert this with black. But yeah, this does seem like an unnecessary risk for Karyakin to take. Perhaps he overlooked rook d5 as a defense. I'm not sure. But anyways, after rook takes d1, let's say, queen takes d1, and then something like rook h8, black shouldn't be in any danger, but I don't think he runs any risk of winning the game. Instead, he went rook e5, trying to keep more pieces on the board. And then he played bishop g2, which strikes me as a very strange move. I guess he realized he was going to have to play d5 at some point, because d6 is sort of a soft spot. And he wanted the bishop on the other side of that pawn, so that after rook d4, d5, it had access to the e4 square. I'm not sure. But that seems like the only explanation I can come up with. Now queen d2 was played by Karyakin, and now the bishop attacks. He has to play something like bishop f3, or bishop h3, or bishop e4, and he's still doing fine, but white does get to pick up this pawn on b4. So he has managed to generate enough play to win his pawn back, and yeah, I still don't feel like, my computer's announcing dead equality. I still don't feel like black has that much chance to actually win this position, although some chances still exist. But it looks like it's white with all the play after he takes on b4 and goes queen to h6 and so forth. But instead, all right, so here Caruana, presumably in some time pressure, made a mistake. He played rook e4, which ordinarily would be fine, but in this case it allows rook takes d5, which is a more or less crushing rook sacrifice. White finally manages to break through against black's king sitting in the middle. And so actually after e takes d5, queen takes d5, there's no way to stop all of white's threats without giving all of the material back with great interest. So right now the threat is queen d7, mate. And there's actually no convenient way to stop this. So let's look at all the possible defenses. So rook d8 obviously fails to queen f7 mate. That rook's got to stay on f8 covering the f7 square for the moment. Bishop h3 fails, of course, to queen takes e4 check. So that bishop's got to stay on g2 covering the rook on e4. Queen d8 fails to queen b7 check. And mate is going to be coming in a couple moves. So that queen's got to stay covering the d7 square. F5, trying to give an escape square on f6, fails to queen d7 check, king f6, rook d6 check, queen takes d6, queen takes d6. And materially, this doesn't look so bad for black. It's two rooks for a queen. But black's king is too exposed, and the light squares are too weak. That with white's queen and bishop running around, there's going to be some very, very difficult threats to meet. Like, for example, after king g7, bishop e6, yeah, this is not easy for black. Eventually, at some point, he's probably gonna have to give more material back, and then white will definitely be winning the ending. So, f5 doesn't cut it either. The best move probably is rook d4. Point being that white can't play rook takes and keep the attack going because his queen is hanging by the bishop on g2, because bishops move backwards. However, white can play queen takes d4, which after queen takes d4, rook takes d4, this is a winning ending for white. Because, first of all, he's a pawn up, and all of his pawns are very secure. This bishop's covering these two guys. These pawns aren't really under threat. Meanwhile, all of black's guys are isolated, so he's going to have to be constantly babysitting those people. And did I mention that white is up a pawn? So this is relatively trivially winning for white. So that sort of obviously fails. In the game, Caruana tried queen c7, which is a very natural way of defending. It covers the d7 square. It doesn't obviously give something up like the other moves do. Unfortunately, Karyakin can play queen f5, which I mean, the threats are just way too strong. There's too many pieces, or sorry, too many squares that all of black's pieces are tied down to deal properly with all the threats. So the new threat now is to, okay, let's make some random move for black, h4, is to play queen h7 check, king e8, and now not only is black's queen hanging, but also there's just bishop a4, and you're mated. So you've got to deal with that threat, but there's no real easy way to do that. Like, you can play queen c6 to not allow bishop a4. Okay, but now white can play check. Let's take a pawn with check, because why not? And then play bishop d5, and already white's winning all of his material back with interest. So, yeah, like, black's queen has to move somewhere. If it moves to, say, b6, then white plays queen h7 check. And the king's got to step onto the d file, and then he can play bishop takes e4, discovered check, at least, if there's not some mate. So, yeah, if you step onto d6, then it's bishop takes e4 with discovered attack. And, yeah, it's really, really not easy. You can try queen e8 in order to meet queen h7 check with rook f7. But the problem here is that after bishop takes f7, queen takes f7, there's the sting in the tail, rook d7 check, which will win the queen because black is decoyed and skewered and everything, and yeah, he's going to lose the game there. By the way, I should point out that after this and this ending is trivially winning for white, because even if black, like, you might argue that it's winning for white because he's going to have like 3 extra pawns at the end of the line. Even if black had a bunch of pawns on the king side and none of them were hanging right away, long term they're going to drop off the board and white's going to be able to just queen a pawn because black doesn't have enough things and the things are not well coordinated and his king is very not safe. So this is trivially winning for white. So let's go back. That was a look at queen c6. It's really, really hard to suggest other tries. In the game, Caruana tried rook f7 as a last attempt. But the problem is, yeah, that you're immediately giving all the material back, because after bishop takes f7, this bishop's immune to capture because of the skewer queen h7 check, winning the guy on c7. So, white's now a pawn up, and he retains the huge attacking chances on the light squares and around black's king that he previously did. So queen e5 was tried as a sort of last desperate attempt. My computer announces mate in 8 now, but there really is no other good attempt at defending. Should be noted, this bishop on g2 is currently not participating at all, and this conglomeration of bishop and rook here is really awkward. And yeah, white's basically attacking with 3 pieces against sort of 1.5 at the moment. And it's not surprising that white won this very quickly. So rook d7 check, king f8, rook d8 check, and Caruana resigned because the mate is, you have to give up your queen on e8 to prolong mate for the longest possible time. And if king takes f7, then the point is that queen h7 check, king e6, and the very nice mate, queen d7, and white wins. So, I'm sort of glad that the game didn't end in a draw and the event had to be decided by pure tie breaks, but I mean, it sort of was decided by tie breaks in any event, because obviously Caruana wouldn't have gone for such a risky line if he wasn't obligated to win with black. I don't know, I feel like we need some sort of playoff rather than just a pure tie break system. But that's just my opinion. I don't run FIDE, and good thing for that. So, that is going to conclude this video, and that's going to conclude the coverage of the Candidates Tournament 2016. Who knows? I might do the same sort of thing for the World Championship match. I also might not. So like and subscribe and do that sort of thing, and I will see you guys, I don't know when.